All right, buckle up, kids, because on this episode, we're actually going to get some writing done. Actually, I'm not writing right now, I'm on Facebook. All right, well, welcome to the third and final installment of this mini series of the art of storytelling here on the Asia Project vlog. My name is Asia Sampson, and if you've been following along, then you know that in the last two episodes of my vlog, I've dedicated it to the art of storytelling in the hopes that by the time we get to the end, which is this episode, you will have written your very first spoken word poem if you have not been writing spoken word poems already. Now, if you are a seasoned veteran in the spoken word game and you've been writing spoken word poems for a while now, then I hope that you still found this series helpful and you were able to get some techniques that maybe you can apply to your own writing. So if you've been following along, then you know that the very first episode in this series was about the fundamentals of storytelling. Second episode was about mining your life for stories, how we can pull events from our own personal life that we might want to write about. Now we're going to take all of the stuff that we've learned, everything we've discussed so far, we're going to combine it all to create a powerful spoken word poem. All right, I'm hoping that you've watched the first two episodes of this series because we're going to draw on a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about. If you have not seen it yet, please make sure to check out the two video links below, then come back to this video again. If you did watch them, then you'll know that last week I asked you to write down 10 things that have happened in your life, 5 good things and 5 bad things. If you have that list, pull that out now. I'll wait. So take a look at your list and look at the events from your life and choose one that you want to commit to a poem today. Like I said before, there are some poems that are ready to be written while there are others that are not. And if there are some events in your life that you're not quite ready to write about yet, then don't worry about it. There's no pressure to write it. But choose one because we're going to use that to workshop in this episode. All right, you got it? Let's move on. So this is probably going to be the easiest part of this whole exercise. Remember the episode from 2 weeks ago, having a beginning, middle, and end. In other words, A, B, and C. Okay, so I want you to take the event that you chose from your life, and I want you to break it down to its most simplistic form, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Don't overthink this, don't overwrite this. In fact, I only want you to have one sentence for each area. One sentence for beginning, one sentence for middle, and one sentence for the end. So for example, if I wanted to write a poem about my son being born, then I would break it down to something like this. The beginning would be my wife went into labor. My middle would be my wife was having a hard time giving birth, and then my ending would be my son was born. That's it. That's all I want you to do. And the reason why I'm making it super simple like this is because right now I want you to establish the foundation of your story. Like this is the guts of your story, that if I ask you, like, what is your poem about? You should be able to tell me in just those 3 lines exactly what your poem is about without having to go into detail. Have you ever had one of those moments where you're writing a poem and then somewhere in the middle of it, you're like, I don't know where this goes next. I don't know where to go with this. The reason why a lot of people have that issue is because they never established the story to begin with. And that's what we're doing right now in its most simplistic form, establishing the story. So go ahead and do that. A, B, and C, have some lines, write your story. All right, stage 1, writing the skeleton. This should be super simple also, because all I want you to do is expand that A, B, and C. We're going to write down that story as simple as we possibly can make it, right? Don't get all poetic with it. Don't start adding in metaphors and imagery. Write it down the same way you would tell that story to a friend, right? There's a reason why I'm asking you to do this. So I want you to write it down from beginning to the end, as simple as you can possibly make it, and then we'll come right back with stage 2. All right, stage 2, fleshing it out. Take a look at your skeleton poem. Super simple, right? Now, it's not the best poem. It's not the poem that's ready to go on stage, but I'm having you do this for a reason. Because although you may not have the best draft of a poem in your hands right now, what you do have is the most simplest to follow draft of a poem that you'll ever have. Your story cannot be any more simpler than it is right now. And the reason why I had you do this is because we're going to start to beef up those lines. But while we do that, we still need to give our audience a simple story to follow. So often, poets will overwrite their stories. They start to add all the stuff in there, drop dope bars, but it sounds great. But then we're like, what is this poem about? Where are we? What is going on right now? We don't know because we've gotten lost in the beautiful language. I once had a poet say to me, just say the damn thing. Like, stop overwriting it. Stop adding all the stuff in beautiful language. We know that you can do that, but sometimes we just want to hear you say the damn thing. So what we do here is we preserve some of the lines from our skeleton and build up all the lines in between. That way, as you start to tell your poem, somewhere in there, you are giving us what we call mile markers to let us know where we are in your story. That's a very key ingredient for us to follow. If you listen to any of my poems, here and there I will drop the most simplest lines. I'll just tell you how it is. But that gives you kind of a marker to let you know where you are in my story, and I can guide you along. So basically it would look something like this. I would start with the beginning, do some really cool language and some metaphors and some imagery, and then give you a simple line. And then go back to some metaphors and beautiful imagery and bars, then another simple line. And on and on and on and on until you get to the very end. And now I've led you through my story without you having to think about where you were in my story. Now, if you're writing a poem that's just meant to be read, then don't worry about all this mile marker stuff. Just throw in all the colorful language and metaphor and hidden meanings that you want, because it's written down on paper and people will reread and reread that poem until they find their own meaning. But if you're writing a poem that's going to be performed for an audience, then you have to understand that when you speak something out loud and your audience hears it, their brain still has to process what you just said. And that takes a while. And by the time they get to processing it, you might have already moved on to the next line, right? So if you have too much metaphor and too much flowery language, then I'm still trying to keep up with your last line, and now I'm lost in your story. I have no idea where you're at or what you're even talking about. So having these mile markers, even if they miss some lines, you are still giving them enough to kind of keep pace with your story. So now that we have your skeleton, we're going to go ahead and build it up while still preserving some of those simple lines. Find the lines to kind of let us know where we are in your story, and then outside of that, go ahead and build it up. All right, admittedly, this part might take a while. In fact, sometimes this is the part that takes me 2 years, 3 years to write one poem. Finding the story is simple. A, B, and C, simple. Write the skeleton, simple. Just tell it how it happened. But now I want you to go line by line and actually flesh out these lines, right? Get beyond the surface and really look at it and ask yourself, is there a better way for me to say this line that no one's ever said it before? I always say that there is no such thing as an original idea, right? When you have an idea, whatever that idea might be, if you want to write about death, you want to write about love, you want to write about whatever, they've all been written before, right? Someone's written it before. But your story, no one's written yet. So I mean, automatically, your story is already unique, right? However, now you have to really give that story some depth. Like, you can't just let us know what happened. You have to paint the picture of what happened. So for example, if I wanted to write about racism towards Asian people, I can't just say racism is bad. I would rather tell you the story of an event that happened to me that tells you racism is bad without me ever having to say it. Or instead of me saying I really loved her about my wife, I would rather tell you a story of something that my wife and I did that makes you look at it and go, he really loves her, without me having to say it. So that's why this part is a bit difficult, because now you're going to take that skeleton and really give it life. Also take a look at your beginning, middle, and end, because sometimes you may not want to start at the beginning. You might want to start with the end and move backwards. There's so many creative things you can do right now with this story as you're starting to flesh it out. You already have the base. You already know how your story goes. You already know the beginning, middle, and end. That's already intact. So you should no longer have an issue of, oh, well, I don't know where to go with this. Well, if you don't know where to go with it, revert back to your skeleton and remind yourself how that story flowed. But right now, this is where we start to add some depth and add some meat. I mean, that's why it's called fleshing it out. We're taking that skeleton and adding some flesh to it and giving it life. So breathe life into those bones. Take your time with it and build up the story, and it will come back with the most important stage of all. So I'm assuming that by now you have this fleshed out poem. Sounds a lot nicer, a lot more powerful, way better than the skeleton poem that you had. But I can guarantee you that we're not done yet. Like, we still have 2 stages left to go. And I mention this because a lot of poets, this is where they stop. Like, they look at their poem and they're like, all right, it's done. I'm ready to take it to the open mic. But it's not even ready yet. If you ever wonder why sometimes poems are lacking, it's because this is the stage where they stop. They looked at it and like, all right, it's complete. But there is so much more that we can do and so much more that's still missing from that poem. So this is the part where I give you my secret sauce, if you will. Now, to be fair, I didn't come up with this. Poets have been doing this forever. It's just that probably some of them didn't know they were doing it. And I just decided to put a name to it so I can include it in my workshop. This is what I call finding the angle. Now, what is finding the angle? Well, basically, it's our gimmick. It's us doing something to our work that will allow people to remember that work, right? So for example, I have a poem called 90s Love. If you know my work, then you'll know that poem. It's basically a love poem comparing someone to how I love the 90s. Now, someone can go up to other people and be like, did you hear Asia's love poem? And they'll be like, which love poem? I don't know what you're talking about. It's not easy to remember that someone did a poem about love or death or whatever. But they might say, have you heard Asia's 90s poem? And immediately people are like, oh my God, I love that poem. Maybe. People remember angles, right? Because it's our way of giving them something to wrap that poem with. It's basically us gifting this poem in this nice little package. It's the packaging to our poem that will help them remember it. So one example of an angle is the objectifying poem. Now, I'm not sitting here telling you to write a poem that objectifies something, like women. That's not what I'm saying. An objectifying poem is where you basically take an object, which on the surface seems to have nothing to do with the story you're about to tell, then take the story you're about to tell, and then mash them together based off of their similarities. Remember back in school, we used to do this thing called Venn diagrams, where you would draw 2 concentric circles, and on one circle you write one word, and then on another circle you write the other word, and then where they overlap, you would write what these two have in common. That's what objectifying poem is. Basically, it's basically you're making us see the poem in a way that we've never seen it before, right? Black Phoenix, a poet out of the Carolinas, he has this poem called Rubik's Cube, where he basically takes his love life and then compares it to a Rubik's Cube. Now, on the surface, you'd be like, well, what does Rubik's Cube have anything to do with love? Well, he breaks it down for you in the poem, where basically love gets confusing and it gets torn apart, and then now you have to piece it back together and make all the colors match. Like, he did a phenomenal job, basically showing us love in a way that we've never seen it before. And that is basically what objectifying poems do. So another example of an angle is the list poem. Now, this should be pretty self-explanatory, but if you don't know what list poems are, I can guarantee you've probably heard one before. It's when poets go up there and they're like, 10 ways to make love to me. 1, and then they say something, and then they go 2, and then they say something. List poems are pretty cool. Like, some subjects like do really great with list poems, right? It's basically like instructions to something or whatever. They're basically wrapping like their subject in the way of a list, and that's pretty easy to follow too. When you're watching a poem being performed that way, you can remember what number you're on, and you can kind of follow the story a little bit better. A perfect example of a list poem is my friend George Yamazawa. He has this poem about how to tell if you're an Asian from the South. 1, and he just tells you these things about being Asian in the South. And what's cool about the poem is that it gives you social commentary, but he also makes it really entertaining. Now, another example of an angle is one of my favorites, the persona poem. It's basically you doing the poem from the persona of someone or something else. 13 of Nazareth from Virginia does a poem from the perspective of the bullet that killed Martin Luther King. So instead of him just doing a poem about Martin Luther King being assassinated, he decided, I'm going to write this poem from the perspective of that bullet. And that is genius, right? Because you don't even know what he's talking about until like halfway through. You're like, wow, he's talking about the bullet that killed Martin Luther King. Sierra de Mulder from Minnesota has another great persona poem. She does her poem from the perspective of Jeffrey Dahmer's mother, right? Not a poem about Jeffrey Dahmer, not a poem about killing. She does the poem about the mother who had to raise him. Another example of an angle is a parallel poem. I've done a few parallel poems. I love parallel poems. Parallel poems are basically two storylines happening at the same time, and yet they seem to have similarities between them, right? Or two storylines happening at one time, and then they kind of merge together. So I got the idea to write parallel poems when I started seeing movies that had different storylines that weren't connected, but then were connected somehow or got connected at the end. So for example, right now I have a poem called Blink. And in Blink, there are two storylines happening. On one storyline is Jose Rizal, who was a Filipino martyr and poet who was executed by Spaniards. And the story with that is him walking from his jail cell to where the firing squad was. And on the other storyline, happening simultaneously, was the moment that I married my wife. And I was standing at the altar watching her walk down the aisle. Now, on the surface, these two things don't seem to have anything in common, right? But I would jump from one storyline to the other, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, until the very end, where I would basically tell you that we die for the things that we love. And then you realize why those two things were connected. And then finally, the last example of an angle that I have is the reveal poem. I love reveal poems. Reveal poems are when you have no idea what the poet is talking about until the very end they reveal some big thing to you or big secret. J. Lee Ald, who is one of my favorite poets as I was getting into the scene, he's out of California. He does this comedic poem about getting into a fight, and the whole time you think he's talking about getting into a fight with somebody. That's the whole poem, was him getting into this this barroom fight after drinking too much. And at the end, he gets beat up, basically, and he goes to the ER and he sees another lady there who was bleeding. And he said, I hope that she didn't get that because she's in an abusive relationship and he got drunk and hit her. And you did not know that that's where that was coming from. All you thought was he's talking about this time that he got into a fight with someone, only to find out that the whole poem was about domestic violence to begin with. Reveals are great. If you can pull off a great reveal poem that no one saw coming, like, that's just masterful. So obviously there are different types of angles, right? What I just mentioned, these examples are just the tip of the iceberg. If you start watching some poetry videos, you'll start seeing angles everywhere, the little things that poets use to wrap their poem in. I mean, that's basically what we're doing with an angle, is we are wrapping our poem, we are wrapping this gift, and we're presenting this gift. But here's the caveat, and I cannot stress this enough. Story goes before angle. All right, let me repeat that. Story goes before angle. That means you don't come up with an angle first and be like, oh, what story can I put in this? It's just like when you go get a gift for someone, you don't go buy the packaging in the box and the wrapping paper and be like, all right, let me see what I can fit in this and give it to someone. No, you buy the gift first. You write your story first. And then you just find cool packaging. That's what an angle is. You just find a way to package it. Now, that doesn't mean that you should look out for angles. In fact, I watch a lot of random TV. Like, I'll watch shows that, like, who watches this stuff, right? Like, sometimes I'll watch, like, nature shows or whatever because they'll give me, like, tidbits and facts about different animals. I'm like, oh, that was pretty cool. And then I'll write it down. And then later, I might have a story, and I'm looking for an angle for that story. And I'm like, oh, I remember seeing this thing. I'm going to use this thing and apply it to my story. Like my poem about my sister, Awakening. A long time ago, I was watching Animal Planet, I think, and I learned about woolly caterpillars and about how every winter they freeze to death, and then in the spring, like, they thaw out and they're alive again. Like, they literally die for the winter, and then they come back to life in the spring. And then when my sister passed, I was writing her poem. I wrote her poem first, and I'm like, I need something to package this with. And I remembered that story, the woolly caterpillar. So I kind of compared her death and what happened with her to the death and rebirth of this woolly caterpillar, and suddenly became one of my heartfelt, most powerful poems that I'd ever written to date. And that's what I mean, is that if you find an angle, if you find a really cool, I'm going to do this concept, cool, write it down, but don't look for a story to fit that concept. Come up with a story first. Have a great poem already, and then just take this angle, throw it in like spice, and make it better. Now, I want you to look at your poem again. Look at the story, and then try to think, what can I add to this story, or what can I wrap this story with that will make this story memorable, right? I love finding angles. It's like the fun part, right? It's like when I've written everything down and everything looks cool, I'm like, all right, I want to find an angle. And then when you find that angle, inject that angle into your poem by looking for their similarities. Take some descriptive words and some things about that angle and just kind of sprinkle them throughout your poem so that we can tie the two together. It takes a while to master this, right? But once you do, like, it makes your poem so much more memorable. All right, so for the last stage of this writing process, I'm probably going to take more time talking about this stage than I did with any of the other stages. Because it's not just important to come up with a beginning, middle, and end to our story, and then writing a skeleton off of that beginning, middle, and end, and then fleshing out that skeleton, and then now taking that fleshed out piece and applying an angle to it. That's all great. But I don't know if you're anything like me, but by now I probably have 5 pages worth of writing just one poem, which would probably take like 10 minutes to perform. And we don't want that unless your goal is to write a 10-minute poem. This is the part where people sometimes think it's not important. I've had poets be like, you know, I don't edit my poems. Or they'll say something like, editing takes away from the purity of it. Man, that is such bullshit. Sorry. It's true. Editing is everything. In fact, when it comes to the writing process, I would say 70% of my writing is in the editing. Editing is what gives your story shine. It's what draws out details. If you're a sculptor and you took this slab of marble and you chiseled away, and now you have this form of, let's say, a man, right? You have this form like this, right? And it looks kind of messy, it's all jagged. And then you detail it a little bit more and kind of give it form. It's like, okay, cool, we know it's a man now. And then you add the angle to it, which is like, all the little tiny details and all the little different things that makes it really stand out and look unique. But it's not done until you've refined it, until you've sanded it smoother, until it really becomes like pristine. And that is what editing does. I love editing, right? I love looking at this 5-page poem that I have, and what can I get rid of? What can I take away to simplify the story again? Because remember, in the very beginning, we started off with this very simple story, ABC, and then we skeletoned it out. Super simple, right? Remember I said it was going to be the most simplest draft that you'll have. Then we started adding things to it, right? And we started to add angles, and we started adding metaphors, and we started adding colorful language. We did all this stuff to it, and then at some point it might look garbled again, like, oh, now I can't follow the story because I added so much detail and I added so much of this. Now, let's take out some stuff and get back to the story. Here's a good example. It's like if I'm naked and I'm like, I know you're picturing it. Like, I'm naked and I'm like, all right, I'm going to get myself ready to go out, but I don't know what to wear. So here's my skeleton. Now I'm just going to throw all these clothes that I like on me, right? These are my favorite things. Then I look in the mirror and I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, I have, a cardigan, a sweater, 2 polo shirts, a t-shirt, pair of pants, and shorts on top of that, and all the jewelry I own is on me. Like, this is not cool. Editing is now where I start to take away some of those articles of clothing to like get back down to me looking like a human being and not a walk-in closet. Editing is so important. And when you edit, you really have to look at your work and ask yourself, like, is this even important? Like, what does this do for my story? If it doesn't do anything for your story, take it out of there. And now I know some people that are like, well, I don't want to take this out because it's like my favorite part. It's like, this line was fire. Even if it had nothing to do with the story, you're going to keep it in there just because it was dope when you wrote it. Get rid of it. In fact, if you feel really bad about throwing out like dope lines that you've written, then open up a separate document and in there just start pasting all of your discarded lines, right? Because these lines you didn't want to get rid of and throw away completely, but I'm going to put it to the side because it just doesn't have anything to do with this poem. I might be able to use it in a poem later. Be really discerning. Like, really ask yourself, is this doing anything for my story? Make it concise. A lot of times people's attention span when they're listening to poetry, probably no more than 3 minutes and 30 seconds, unless you're really good and you can follow the story along, like Sonny Patterson, who can do a poem for 5-10 minutes and people will listen to her throughout the whole thing because she just grips you like that. But for the most part, our attention span doesn't go beyond 3 minutes and 30 seconds. That's why slam competitions are usually only 3 minutes and 10. Now, what are some edits that I do? Like, some edits that I do first is I take away all the transitional words that don't really do much for the story, right? Like, you ever hear a poet go, see, and then they say whatever? Like, I hate the word see. Like, why do you start a sentence with see? I mean, we are seeing. I'm watching you perform. You don't need to say see before your sentence, right? Just say the sentence, right? A lot of times too, I take out a lot of the transitions because the transitions to get from here to here in my story, there's so much transition that it's like it just drags the poem out. If you watch a really great movie or television show, you'll see that they'll just jump cut. They'll cut from one scene to the next. They don't give you the transition. If you see a character start out like in the office and in the next scene they're at home, then you knew that somewhere along the way they went home. They don't need to show you this person driving home because that's just adding to the story that has nothing to do with the story at all, unless it does, but most times it does not, right? So why even add that drive home? Just go from your character being in the office to your character being at home, and we'll associate the fact that somewhere in that timeline they went home. So do the same thing with your poems. Take away the transitions that don't really need to be there. Just go from one scene to the next. I love cutting like that because then it keeps you in this momentum of the story. Another thing I do when it comes to edits is I ask the same question I asked in the very beginning, which is, am I just saying the damn thing or am I just dressing it up for no reason? Like I said, a poet friend of mine said to me, like, dude, just say it. Sometimes the best thing to do is just say it rather than like dress it up with all these fancy words. Just say it. Like, instead of saying something like, I almost died a tragic death, I could feel the cold enter through my mouth and shiver my bones. Or just look straight into the audience and be like, I almost died. And that in and of itself is already going to be powerful, right? So another way to edit is to look at your poem. There's some pretty spots, but don't forget to keep the simple lines that you wrote during the skeleton. Those simple lines, again, lets us know where you are in the story. And if you could still see those simple lines scattered through your poem, then you know that we'll be able to follow your story. All right, so now comes the million-dollar question, and that is, how do I know when I'm done? Oh, the one question that plagues all of us writers, and believe me, you don't get better at knowing that. Like, you will always wonder whether or not something is done. A good friend of mine, poet, Catalyst Alcindor, and I know I'm dropping a lot of names during this video, but that's because I study poetry. I like to watch other spoken word poets and pick up things from all of them. But he said something to me. He said, a poem is never finished, it's just abandoned. Like, where do you want to abandon this poem? You might tweak it again later. You know, you might write a poem and be like, oh, this is the best thing I've ever written. And then a year later, you're like, no, it's not. I can tweak it again and tweak it again and tweak it again. I will do another video later on going into this a little bit more in depth about when to know when your poem is done. But here's what I do. So let's say I finish my poem, right? I wrote my ABCs, I turned it into a skeleton, I fleshed it out, then I added an angle to it, and then I edited the hell out of it. I consider it done for now. I will then now take that to the open mic. I don't put it into memory yet. I would just take the poem, go to the open mic, and I would read it. And as I'm reading it, I would see where the crowd is responding. Oh, they like that line. oh, they didn't like that line, or oh, I thought this line would hit harder and it didn't. Now I can start to see how the flow of the poem works, how it's coming out of my mouth, how it's being recited. Is it smooth or is it choppy? I gain a lot of, insight just from performing it the first time at an open mic. Then I come home and then I start making tweaks to the notes that I had in my head as I'm reading the poem. Like I said, I haven't put it into memory yet, so I'm really not committed to the poem yet. I'm just really testing out the waters. Comedians do this all the time. They take a stack of jokes, they go to their local open mic, and then they just test out all these jokes. And then some jokes are strong, some didn't do so well, and then the ones that are strong, they combine them and turn them into a special. That's how comedians roll. Why can't poets do the same thing? Test out your poem. Go to an open mic, read it, see what they like. Come back home, make some tweaks again, bring it back again. Keep doing that until, okay, it's tight, it's how I want it. Now, I'm sure I could mess with it even more, but you know what? No, I'm good. I'm leaving it as is, and then I'm going to continue forward. That's all it is. That's how you know when you're done. That's how I know I'm done, right? That's how in my gut I feel like this is ready to go. So that's it. You wrote a poem. You took an event from your life, you applied storytelling fundamentals to it, then we workshopped the hell out of it. We wrote a beginning, middle, and end. We wrote a skeleton, we fleshed out that skeleton, we added an angle, and then we edited the hell out of it, and now I hope you have a product that's at least ready to be shared. It may not be finished. I mean, this video only lasts for however long this video lasts, but you can continue on. You can continue to work on it at your own pace and, really fine tune it. But really, that's the key. It's taking it that extra step, fine tuning the little things to make it as tight and as concise as possible. And don't overwork it though. Just know in your gut when it's done, right? But for now, you should have a great poem on your hands. This process, I will say right now, is not the end all. Let me just make that clear. This is the process that works for me. This is the process I came up with through the years of just learning about spoken word poetry, and finally this is the process that worked for me. Now for you, this may work, it may not. Take what works for you and apply it. And it's not, these stages don't always go like, one after the other. It doesn't always happen that way. I jump around a lot, right? Like I might write a skeleton, right? And then I flesh it out and I find an angle, but then I might come back and rewrite the skeleton again. Or I might be editing as I go, right? As I'm, fleshing it out, I'm like, oh, this line's not gonna do good here. Let me take that out, or I might have to rearrange some things once I figure out a different angle or I find a better angle, right? It's all about just using these stages and manipulating them and moving them around in order for you to come up with a viable product to present to people. You know yourself better than I could ever know you. All I'm here to do is give you the formula that I use. Feel free to customize, tweak it however you want. And that basically concludes this 3-part series on the art of storytelling. Wait, that sounded really weird, huh? That sounded like one of those high school films that you would watch in class, and at the end they're like, and that basically concludes the reproductive system. That sounded so weird. Anyway, that concludes this 3-part series on the art of storytelling. I will be back next week with a brand new video. I just don't know what topic I want to cover yet because I have so many ideas, and I just have to make sure that the topic I cover next week follows this series seamlessly, right? I just want to make sure it follows it really well. Until then though, please make sure you like this video, share this video, show it to all the writers that you know who probably are interested in writing their first spoken word poem, or if they are spoken word poets and just kind of want to refine their craft, and send them our way. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Get everybody to subscribe to our channel, and also follow us on all of our social media accounts at The Asia Project. My name is Asia Sampson, and until then, speak like you mean it. All right, let me just go back to pretending I was writing. Words, 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 words.